the morning sun filtering through the expansive, floor-to-ceiling windows of the Forrester Creations CEO office illuminated a scene of profound regret and lingering, suffocating desperation. For Steffy Forrester Finnegan, the heavy, crushing weight of the previous night was a monumental burden she desperately wanted to erase from her memory. Fleeing the sun-drenched shores of Monaco, deeply traumatized by the horrifying revelation that her husband, John Finnegan, had hidden the terrifying presence of Sheila Carter on his commercial flight, Steffy had sought refuge in the familiar, insulated walls of her family's empire. She had drowned her profound sense of betrayal and shattered safety in a sea of alcohol, finding an unexpected, grieving companion in Carter Walton. The trusted chief operating officer was reeling from his own devastating heartbreak following his wife Daphne's severe infertility diagnosis and her sudden, agonizing departure to Paris. What began as a shared commiseration over their collapsing marriages quickly and dangerously devolved into a catastrophic, alcohol-fueled lapse in judgment. For Steffy, crossing the ultimate line with her father's best friend and legal counsel was a horrifying mistake, a desperate, blind grasp for comfort in a moment of absolute vulnerability. She awoke with a singular, frantic goal, to bury the memory of their passionate encounter deep within the darkest recesses of her mind, pretending it never happened in a desperate bid to preserve the remaining fragments of her life. However, the psychological aftermath of that fateful, shadowy night manifested in a terrifyingly different and destructive manner for Carter Walton. A man who had spent his entire adult life playing the role of the reliable, steadfast, and morally upright executive, Carter found himself completely unmoored and intoxicated by the taste of forbidden passion. The shared vulnerability, the raw, unfiltered emotion, and the intense physical connection of their encounter had flipped a dangerous, irreversible switch deep within his psyche. While Steffy viewed the night as a shameful, drunken aberration that needed to be locked away forever, Carter began to perceive it as a profound, destined awakening. The agonizing, paralyzing grief he had felt over Daphne's departure was suddenly and violently eclipsed by an overwhelming, consuming obsession with the Forrester heiress. He could not simply compartmentalize the intimate connection they had forged amidst the shadows of the executive suite. Instead of guilt or regret, Carter felt an insidious, growing possessiveness. The memory of Steffy's touch, the lingering scent of her perfume, and the desperate way she had clung to him became a psychological anchor, pulling him away from his past and dragging him into a dark, uncharted territory of romantic fixation. This dangerous emotional shift became glaringly and painfully apparent when Daphne Rose Walton unexpectedly returned from Paris, her heart full of contrition and a renewed, desperate determination to fight for her marriage. Daphne had realized that running away from her functional depression and her husband's unwavering support was a massive mistake. She arrived back in Los Angeles ready to explore alternative paths to parenthood, eager to reclaim the profound love she thought she had abandoned. But the man she returned to was no longer the devoted, rescuing husband who had tearfully begged her to stay just days prior. Carter's reaction to Daphne's return was chillingly distant, remarkably cold, and devoid of the warmth that had once defined their relationship. He looked at the woman he had vowed to love and cherish, but his mind was entirely, obsessively consumed by the image of Steffy. The emotional real estate in Carter's heart had been violently usurped. He realized with a terrifying clarity that he could not go back to Daphne, not when every fiber of his being was yearning for the powerful woman sitting in the CEO chair just down the hall. He began to systematically dismantle his marriage, pushing a heartbroken and confused Daphne away, his sole focus narrowing with laser precision onto Steffy Forrester Finnegan. Unbeknownst to Carter's shifting, darkening mental state, Finn had raced back to Los Angeles in a state of sheer panic and profound remorse. The brilliant doctor had realized the catastrophic magnitude of his error in Monaco. Hiding Sheila's presence on his flight, even under the misguided guise of protecting Steffy's peace of mind, was a monumental betrayal of trust that had triggered his wife's severe, lingering PTSD. Finn arrived at the Cliff House armed with desperate apologies, grand romantic gestures, and a solemn, unwavering vow to eradicate his biological mother from their lives permanently. He pleaded for forgiveness, laying his heart bare, completely oblivious to the devastating fact that his wife had already sought comfort in the arms of another man. For Steffy, Finn's desperate attempts to make amends provided the perfect, albeit guilt-ridden, shield. She eagerly accepted his apologies, desperately clinging to the familiar, safe structure of her marriage to build a fortress against the terrifying reality of what she had done with Carter. She wanted to rebuild her life with Finn, using his devotion as a desperate countermeasure to the suffocating secret she harbored. But Carter Walton was absolutely not willing to be relegated to the status of a drunken, forgotten mistake. As Steffy attempted to reestablish her marital boundaries and project an aura of professional normalcy at Forrester Creations amidst the escalating corporate war with Logan, Carter began a relentless, unnerving campaign of romantic pursuit. He completely discarded the professional decorum that had defined his illustrious career, replacing it with a bold, unyielding presence that left Steffy feeling trapped, panicked, and deeply claustrophobic. He would linger in her office long after business meetings had concluded, his gaze heavy with unspoken memories and dark, possessive promises. He found manufactured excuses to brush against her arm, to stand just a fraction of an inch too close, his voice dropping to a low, intimate register that sent shivers of sheer terror down Steffy's spine. The sanctuary of her family's company was rapidly transforming into a psychological prison. Every time the heavy oak doors of the CEO office clicked shut, Steffy's heart would hammer against her ribs, terrified of what the obsessed executive might do or say next. The intensity of Carter's pursuit was matched only by the sheer audacity of his actions. He no longer cared about the optics, the whispers of the staff, or the potential for absolute professional ruin. He was a man possessed, driven by an insatiable, blinding hunger for a woman who was desperately trying to run away from him. When Steffy explicitly demanded that they maintain a strictly professional relationship, citing her reconciliation with Finn and the catastrophic, life-altering consequences of their secret, Carter's response was a chilling dismissal of her boundaries. He argued with a terrifying calm that their connection was far too profound to be ignored, twisting their shared trauma into a delusional narrative of destined, inevitable love. He gaslit her frantic attempts to distance herself, portraying her return to Finn as a cowardly, fearful retreat into a broken, dishonest marriage. Steffy felt entirely suffocated, her daily routine at Forrester Creations becoming an agonizing tightrope walk over a gaping abyss of humiliation and public scandal. She was drowning in the sheer force of Carter's unwanted affection, paralyzed by the fear that forcefully rejecting him might provoke him to expose their devastating secret to the world. The situation escalated from suffocating to highly combustible when Carter's obsession morphed into a vicious, unyielding jealousy directed squarely at John Finnegan. Whenever Finn visited the Forrester Creations building to bring Steffy lunch, to offer a supportive embrace, or simply to check in on his wife, Carter's demeanor would darken into a barely concealed, simmering rage. The sight of Steffy smiling at her husband, accepting his kisses, and projecting the image of a happily reconciled couple triggered a volatile, explosive anger within the normally composed lawyer. Carter began to view Finn not as Steffy's rightful, loving husband, but as an unworthy interloper who was stubbornly standing in the way of his own twisted happily ever after. This toxic, consuming jealousy began to bleed into their professional interactions, creating an atmosphere of palpable, suffocating tension that permeated the entire executive floor and left the staff on edge. Carter's hostility toward Finn soon manifested in aggressive, confrontational behavior right in the middle of the Forrester corridors. Under the guise of enforcing corporate security and minimizing distractions during the critical, high-stakes preparations for Eric Forrester's haute couture launch, Carter began to actively and maliciously undermine Finn's presence at the building. He would rudely interrupt their private, tender moments, coldly citing urgent legal matters or pressing executive decisions that required Steffy's immediate, undivided attention. During one particularly tense and public encounter near the design labs, Carter openly challenged Finn's understanding of Steffy's immense corporate responsibilities, his tone laced with a condescending arrogance that left the good doctor deeply confused and highly defensive. Finn, who had always considered Carter a close friend and a trusted, loyal ally of the Forrester family, was completely baffled by the sudden, venomous animosity radiating from the coup. He attributed it to the overarching stress of the Logan corporate war and the loss of Hope Logan, completely oblivious to the predatory, obsessive nature of the man standing before him. For Steffy, witnessing these tense, veiled standoffs between her husband and her obsessed lover was akin to watching a lit match slowly descend toward a massive pool of gasoline. She was trapped in an agonizing, inescapable purgatory, forced to play the role of the diplomatic peacemaker while her internal world was collapsing in a state of sheer, unadulterated terror. She tried to subtly intervene, desperately attempting to usher Finn away from the building before Carter's volatile jealousy could provoke a physical altercation or, far worse, a devastating verbal confession of their night together. The psychological toll of managing Carter's unhinged, unpredictable behavior while simultaneously rebuilding fragile trust with Finn was pushing the Forrester heiress to the absolute brink of a nervous breakdown. The dark circles beneath her eyes, the sudden weight loss, and the constant, nervous tremor in her hands were glaring, undeniable indicators of a woman buckling under the crushing weight of a monumental, life-destroying secret. However, the toxic, shifting dynamics on the executive floor did not go unnoticed by the patriarchs of the Forrester family. Ridge Forrester, a man whose paternal instincts were as sharply honed as his legendary sartorial eye, began to observe the bizarre and highly disturbing interactions between his daughter and his most trusted advisor. Ridge had always relied on Carter Walton to be the steady, unemotional, and fiercely loyal anchor of the company, the voice of reason amidst the chaotic storms of family drama and corporate espionage. But the Carter he was witnessing now was a complete stranger, a man whose eyes tracked Steffy with a hungry, possessive intensity, a man who bristled with uncharacteristic, primal aggression whenever Finn's name was mentioned in casual conversation. Ridge's initial confusion quickly hardened into a deep, unsettling, and terrifying suspicion. He knew his daughter better than anyone on earth, and he recognized the unmistakable, haunting signs of a woman living in a state of constant, paralyzing fear. Ridge began to quietly and methodically monitor the situation, his fierce protective instincts entirely overriding his long-standing, decades-old trust in the company's coup. He noticed the subtle, horrifying details, the way Steffy would visibly flinch when Carter entered a room, the way she would deliberately leave her office door wide open during their mandatory meetings, and the sheer, palpable relief that washed over her pale face whenever a third party interrupted their conversations. He also observed the chilling, almost predatory manner in which Carter would position his body between Steffy and the exit, subtly trapping her in his physical orbit and asserting his dominance. The pieces of a horrifying, unthinkable puzzle were slowly beginning to assemble in Ridge's mind. He remembered the night Steffy had returned from Monaco, shattered, traumatized, and heavily intoxicated. He remembered that Carter had also been in the building that exact same night, grieving the devastating loss of Daffy. The horrifying realization that his daughter and his best friend might have crossed a line of unimaginable consequence hit Ridge with the force of a physical, breathless blow. Driven by a fierce, undeniable need to protect his daughter and uncover the absolute truth, Ridge initiated a covert, highly classified internal investigation into the events of that fateful night and the subsequent, agonizing weeks. He could not afford a public scandal, especially with the media already in an absolute frenzy over Hope Logan's defection and the impending, high-stakes launch of Eric's haute couture line. Ridge needed undeniable, irrefutable proof before he confronted the man who held the legal keys to the Forrester kingdom. He subtly enlisted the help of the company's head of security, Charlie Weber, under the strict guise of Reviewing security protocol following the recent corporate espionage threats from Katie Logan and Bill Spencer. Ridge instructed Charlie to pull the archived security footage from the executive floor on the specific night of Steffy's return, specifically requesting detailed access logs for the CEO office, the private elevators, and the underground parking garage. The internal investigation was a silent, ticking time bomb, its countdown echoing ominously in the hallowed, luxurious halls of Forrester Creations. Charlie Weber, ever vigilant and blissfully unaware of the true, devastating nature of his assignment, began to meticulously comb through hours of digital archives. Every keystroke, every retrieved video file brought Ridge one step closer to the devastating truth that Steffy was so desperately trying to conceal from the world. The security cameras, while strictly prohibited from recording directly inside the CEO office, captured the undeniable, damning narrative of the corridors. They held the digital ghosts of a heavily intoxicated, stumbling Steffy entering her suite, followed shortly by a visibly distressed and equally inebriated Carter. And more damningly, the logs held the precise timestamp of Carter's departure, hours later, in the quiet, desolate, and heavily shadowed hours of the early morning. As Ridge gathered the mounting, circumstantial evidence, his fury began to build into a volcanic eruption, directed not at his daughter, whom he viewed as a vulnerable, heartbroken victim of trauma and alcohol, but entirely at Carter Walton. In Ridge's eyes, Carter had committed the ultimate, unforgivable betrayal. He had taken gross advantage of a traumatized, inebriated woman who was reeling from the terrifying collapse of her marriage and her profound fear of Sheila Carter. He had violated the sacred, unspoken trust of the Forrester family, abusing his position of immense power and physical proximity to prey upon the heiress. The thought of Carter's ongoing, obsessive harassment of Steffy within the safe walls of their own company filled Ridge with a violent, protective rage that threatened to completely eclipse his rational judgment. He was meticulously preparing to unleash a storm of biblical proportions upon the man he had once considered a brother. Meanwhile, Steffy remained completely, tragically unaware of her father's covert investigation, her entire focus consumed by the daily, agonizing struggle to survive Carter's suffocating obsession. She was living in a state of perpetual hypervigilance, her nerves frayed to the absolute point of snapping. The severe psychological torment of her secret was manifesting in debilitating physical symptoms: sleepless nights staring at the ceiling, sudden, crippling panic attacks in the boardroom, and a complete inability to focus on the critical business strategies required to combat the rising threat of Logan Creations. She felt entirely isolated, unable to confide in her mother, Taylor Hayes, who was already dealing with the terrifying, looming threat of Sheila Carter's blackmail. She certainly could not tell Finn, knowing with absolute certainty that the revelation would not only destroy his devoted heart but potentially provoke a violent, tragic, and deadly confrontation between her husband and her obsessed stalker. Carter, blinded by his own delusional fixation and overwhelming arrogance, failed entirely to notice the subtle, dangerous shifts in Ridge's behavior. He was so deeply consumed by his twisted belief that he and Steffy were destined to be together that he ignored the glaring, flashing warning signs of his impending downfall. He continued to aggressively escalate his pursuit, his actions becoming increasingly reckless, desperate, and unhinged. He began sending Steffy cryptic, highly intimate messages on her private corporate server, leaving expensive, unsolicited romantic gifts on her desk, and subtly threatening to reassign key personnel who interrupted his manufactured moments of privacy with her. His behavior was no longer just highly inappropriate. It was crossing the definitive line into severe corporate harassment, creating a toxic, dangerous workplace environment that threatened the very stability and reputation of Forrester Creations. The impending, catastrophic collision of these volatile elements was absolutely inevitable. Ridge's covert investigation was rapidly approaching its devastating conclusion, the digital evidence painting an undeniable, horrific picture of betrayal, manipulation, and obsession. Finn, fueled by his desperate need to prove his unwavering loyalty to Steffy, was becoming increasingly suspicious of Carter's aggressive posturing. His sharp medical mind beginning to analyze the psychological anomalies and erratic nature of the COO's behavior. And Steffy, trapped in the dead center of this terrifying vortex, was rapidly running out of time, excuses, and options. The humiliating, scandalous truth that she had fought so incredibly hard to bury was about to be violently exhumed, threatening to destroy her hard-won reconciliation with Finn, shatter her father's trust, and detonate a massive scandal that would make the Logan corporate war look like a minor, insignificant inconvenience. The walls of the Forrester empire are closing in, and the fallout from this explosive obsession will leave no one unscathed.